Republicans in Congress have been notably restrained in their criticism of President Trump, even when they've been critical in private. One Republican, though, who has been willing to speak out at times, is Senator Ben Sasse of Nebraska. And Senator Sasse joins me now from Nebraska. Welcome, sir.
Morning.
Let me just start.
Thanks. Welcome to Nebraska.
Yes, sir. Let me just start with asking you an extension of a question that Hugh Hewitt asked you the other day about the anonymous essay, because your initial reaction, frankly, was similar to mine. You're like, I don't know how to talk about it yet. I'm still processing it. But you also noted it's very similar to what you hear from about 2/3 of the senior people at the White House. So you've had a couple of days to digest. What do you make of it, and what bothers you more, the unnamed cabal of people thwarting the will of the people, or the allegations themselves?
Yeah, I don't think that either or works, because there are lots more things than just those to be worried about. The thing I'm most worried about is that our political culture isn't focused on any long-term stuff. And so the president was elected in 2016 because he wanted to disrupt everything. And frankly, a lot needed to be disrupted. But the question is, disruption toward what end? So I guess I've reflected more on the op-ed in the week since it came out, or however many days it was. And I don't understand the morality of the action, frankly. I don't know why you would do it. If you're worried that the president is too impulsive and paranoid, then how can this op-ed do anything other than drive more paranoia? But to your point, yeah, I mean, we hear those of us who are trying to help the White House, and the president has surrounded himself with a number of very good people doing good work and trying to persuade him to take a longer-term vision. I think those people are doing good work by trying to help the president think a little farther down the road. Why you'd write about it in this form, I don't get the morality of that. When
you hear about Gary Cohn yanking a piece of paper off the president's desk to prevent him from pulling out of a South Korean trade agreement, I know where you are on the issue of trade, so you may personally be, oh, good, but the president campaigned on ripping up trade deals. This was what he promised. Where are you on that?
Yeah, so I think we need to be talking about why there's so much job disruption, because there is more than our grandparents knew and than people knew 100 years ago. And there's going to be even more in the future, but it's not because of trade, it's because of automation. So I would like the president to understand that trade is good, trade helps producers, trade helps consumers, but individual advisors don't get to substitute their judgment for the president's judgment. What you'd like is the president to put a chief of staff in place to lead a policy process where a president can, in a dispassionate way, deliberate about lots of information and lots of advice and wisdom and counsel, and then he can make a long-term decision. So one advisor shouldn't be substituting his or her wisdom for the president's, but there should be a process by which the president gets some counsel, and it feels like neither of those things are happening in the right way right now.
Do you think it's important for the president to publicly stabilize his staffing situation in the White House? Because it certainly looks a little dysfunctional to the public.
You know, I don't have any desire to beat the president up, but it's pretty clear that this White House is a reality show, soap opera presidency. I mean, the drama is the drama of Omarosa, and the drama of Cohen, and the drama of Manafort, and the drama of the Woodward quotes, and the drama of these op-eds. What you'd like is the president to not worry so much about the short term of staffing, but the long term of vision casting for America. Pull us together as a people, help us deliberate about where we should go, and then build a team of great, big cause, low ego people around you. Right now, it feels like there's just way too much drama every day, and that distracts us from the longer term stuff we should be focused on together.
You said something that really rang true with me when you said the following on Fox on Friday. Take a listen.
The Congress is a broken institution. We don't deliberate about long-term things. People want you all have an important role to help narrate what's happening in American life, but senators shouldn't aspire to be pundits all day, every day.
Well, Megan McArdle wrote the following about you and said, Sasse has precisely diagnosed the problem, but American politics will not recover unless the doctor is prepared to take his own advice. For Ben Sasse, ironically, has become well known for his public statements on character and constitutional order while doing relatively little on the legislative front. Have you found the Senate that you can't do what you thought you could do when you ran for the Senate? Is it because the body itself is dysfunctional?
I think there's dysfunction in both of these main two branches, right? The legislative branch and the executive branch. I'm proud that we got a piece of legislation passed last month that I authored on the Cyber Solarium Commission, which is to try to upgrade American military planning for the cyber age. And so that kind of stuff is really important, and it should come out of the legislature. But frankly, to really focus the attention of the American public on it, you need the bully pulpit of the White House. And again, I want to go back to the fact that the president has put a lot of good people in around him. General Paul Nakasone, the head of Cyber Command and the NSA, is a really thoughtful, long-term thinker, and kudos to the president for promoting him. But we need both the Congress and the presidency to be focused on helping the American people understand the future of cyber war. Again, I'm glad I got a piece of legislation done on that last month, but the bigger thing we need is a discourse that's partly led by the president about stuff that's 10 years in the future, not 10 hours in the future. And right now, most of D.C. is just addicted to short-term media cycles, and frankly, we need fewer people in Congress who are that obsessed with tomorrow and that obsessed with their own incumbency and more obsessed with the future their kids and grandkids are going to grow up in.
One of the things you said in the wake of the memorials honoring John McCain, you said, the best thing to do would be to really pass some meaningful, tough ethics legislation. And I'm curious, we looked up, and right now, probably the most comprehensive ethics legislation happens to belong to Elizabeth Warren. And I throw it up here, and I'm curious what you think of it. She proposes a lifetime ban on lobbying from former members of Congress, presidents, and agency heads, a ban on senior government officials from owning or trading individual stock, a permanent ban on lobbyist donations to Congress, and all elected officials and candidates for federal office be required to disclose their tax returns. It sounds very similar to some of the rhetoric you were espousing on this.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I'm the second or third most conservative person in the Senate by voting record, but I'm not particularly partisan. I don't care very much about these two parties because I don't think either of them have a long-term vision. But there is a number of things here that Senator Warren and I would agree on. I have a piece of ethics legislation I'm going to be introducing that also says that all tax returns of presidential and vice presidential candidates should be disclosed. We shouldn't have any of this near insider trading stuff happening by members of Congress. We shouldn't have cabinet officials have their spouses raising funds from foreign governments and foreign sources. We should have a much longer ban or cooling off period on former lawmakers going to lobby. So Senator Warren and I are about as far apart on the political spectrum as you can get on most things. But on a number of ethics reform issues, I think she and I might well see eye to eye. There is a crisis of public trust in this country where people across the political spectrum don't think they can trust their lawmakers to ever really want to go back to our Mount Vernons, to go back to where we come from, to go live among our neighbors and coach Little League. But instead, people run for office to want to get to D.C. to become lobbyists and get rich while in office. That's a crisis, and that should stop. So Senator Warren and I should talk more on this topic.
All right, and very quickly, you floated on Twitter that you sometimes think about dropping your party, that you don't always feel like a Republican. You said it again just now. How likely is it that you would leave the Republican Party?
You know, I've been in office for 3.5 years, and I've said since I got there, I conceive of myself as an independent conservative who happens to caucus with the Republicans. And I would like both of these parties to be healthier and be competing to be better than the other one amongst a bunch of good ideas, instead of trying to be less bad than the other one and always say how you're anti. It's just not big enough. But I'm committed to the party of Lincoln and Reagan as long as we can try to reform it and get it back to being a party that's about the universal dignity of all Americans and the First Amendment as the beating heart of American life. But right now, that's not what the party talks about very much.
Senator Ben Sasse, who caucuses with the Republicans from Nebraska, conservative independent from Nebraska. I'll use your description there. Sorry about those Huskers yesterday, but they look like they're coming back. Thank you for coming on.
We'll be back soon. Thanks, Chuck.
Hey, NBC News fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and then click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.